Oh, okay. What's your name?
Lucy.
Lucy. Okay, good to meet you. You ready, Ian? Okay. Well, the other day, LaRouche made a comment that was uh, quite striking for someone who's known LaRouche for a long time, because he said, we're at a moment that's unprecedented in history. A moment where you have two processes underway, both of which are very aggressively underway and are completely diametrically opposed and will determine the future for a long time. And that we're at the point where those processes are intersecting right now. And on the one side, you have the danger of war. And I'll go through this in some detail before I turn it over to Kesha. But the danger of war driven by a global financial disintegration, which is accelerating. And on the other side, you have something changed. And what changed is that it was clear, as we see over the last couple of days, that the decision was made to escalate the war threats because of the escalation of the financial collapse. Now, that's what I'm going to concentrate on for the next few moments, to give you a sense of how rapidly this situation is devolving and moving toward war. Now, the first thing you need to know is that the presidential campaign has nothing to do with what I'm about to discuss with you. There's not a serious person in it. You know, Donald Trump is doing reality TV. Someday they're going to market this and turn it into a TV show. Ted Cruz is a joke. He's a complete fraud. You know, the guy who claims he's a top conservative anti-Wall Street, he sleeps every night with a Goldman Sachs executive. So his wife is. You know, the idea that he's going to take on Wall Street, forget it. His Texas senatorial campaign was funded by Goldman Sachs, which he inadvertently forgot to report. You know, Rubio, the guy, I think Christie has it right, the boy in a bubble. You know, a guy who they're basically hoping is a brainless parrot, very much like Obama. You know, people who like Rubio, what do they say about him? Charismatic. He looks good. He gives a good speech. You remember that from 8 years ago? Didn't we hear that 8 years ago? That was Obama. What's the content? He's owned by the same Wall Street networks. They're pouring huge amounts of money into his campaign. So and then of course you have Jeb Bush. So the Republicans have nothing. And on the Democratic side, Lynn characterized Sanders and Clinton as bums. And we see how bad Clinton is now. She's embracing everything Obama did and saying she's going to go beyond it in terms of protecting Wall Street, in terms of regime change, wars, and so on. And as for Bernie Sanders, here's how you know he's a fraud. He says a lot of things that are interesting about fighting Wall Street and income inequality and getting rid of the private insurance, health insurance companies. And he talks about how people are suffering. He tells the truth on that. People in this country are suffering. People are hurting. People are working 2 or 3 jobs and still can't afford rent. They have to choose between eating and medical care, sending their kids to daycare or not working. People have to make terrible choices. And then he turns around and says, it's good that we have Obama because he brought us back from a depression. So on the one side, he's describing a collapsed physical economy. On the other side, he's praising Obama. You can't have it both ways. You may have seen Obama yesterday with his press conference about how great it is that we're now at 4.9% unemployment, as long as you don't count all the people who are unemployed. He didn't say the latter part, but that's the truth of the matter. Now, here's the point that you have to get in your mind when you think about what am I going to do in the weeks and months ahead. As we're sitting here today, decisions are being made for possibly a Turkish invasion into Syria and the deployment of Saudi Arabian troops into Syria, supposedly as part of an anti-terror coalition. Now, do people actually know much about what the Turks and the Saudis are doing? Do you out here know what they're doing? They're supporting the terrorists. The Turks have been selling stolen oil for ISIS to give ISIS the money they need to recruit the foreign fighters and buy the weapons and so on. They have left the border open so ISIS fighters can come into Syria. They've been asking NATO, they say, if we let you use our air base and if we help you with the refugee crisis, will you let us kill the Kurds? When the Kurds are the only force outside of the Syrian army and the Iranians who are actually fighting ISIS. So the Turks are, and also they almost got us into a war when they shot down a Russian jet, and they're threatening to do it again. Turkey is one of the 3 countries in the Middle East that actually has a long history. And some of it is decent, a lot of it is not good. The Ottoman Empire. But Turkey today has sided with the British Empire and Obama to carry out terrorist assaults and threats against Russia, which could engage a Russian-NATO confrontation. As for the Saudis, 16 of the 19 or so hijackers on 9/11 were Saudis. the decision in the early 20s to put the Ibn Saud family in charge of the Arabian Peninsula. All of those countries were artificial. They threw people hodgepodge into it: Kurds, Alawite, Shia, Sunni, Christians, Yazidi Christians, some Jews. They were all mixed up in a conglomeration of states that can't function. And had they tried to function, they would get smashed, as in the case of Iraq, which actually did emerge as a secular republic and has been destroyed by the Bush, Tony Blair policies. So if you have Turkey go into Syria or Saudi Arabia go into Syria, supposedly to fight terrorists, what are you doing? You're creating a situation where they're going to go up against the one force now that's successful in the anti-terror fight, which is the Russians and the Syrian army. Now, today or in the next couple of days, you're going to hear a lot more about the city of Aleppo, a northern city in Syria, the most populous city, a city with a great history, Christian traditions. It's a center of scholarship and trade, and it's been nearly destroyed by the rebel takeover of the last 3 years. Rebels including Al-Qaeda and including ISIS. They all have an area in there. And as part of the Russian move last October and November into Syria, they made the major priority clearing a pathway along the Mediterranean up to the northern border to free Aleppo from the terrorists. And of course the US said, well, they're attacking moderate rebels. Well, from the standpoint of Syria, the moderate rebels, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, are all doing the same thing. They're trying to destroy the government and kill the people. And so the Syrian army, and you know, the one other point I really think I always emphasize is, I think it has to be emphasized, when they say 250,000 Syrians have been killed because of Assad. Well, over 100,000 of them are Syrian army people who were not killed by Assad. They were killed by the so-called moderates that we arm, the terrorists that we arm. So the idea that Assad is responsible solely for this, as Putin said, there were no refugees from Syria prior to the civil war. Syrians didn't leave. They were happy. They were among the happiest people in the Middle East. It wasn't a great country. There were people who wanted more democracy, more freedom, more participation, some of whom may have been honest about that, others of whom may have been on the payroll of the non-governmental organizations funded by Soros and the National Endowment for Democracy. But it was the US intervention, and Obama in particular saying Assad must go, that led to the breakdown of the crisis. So the Russians, going back to the United Nations last September, came to New York and said to Obama, we want to join you in the anti-terror coalition. By that time, of course, the United States had already been bombing ISIS for a year, with the only result being ISIS had expanded its territory and was recruiting more people. Obama's so-called strategy was a failure unless his strategy was to increase the power of ISIS to defeat Assad, which is probably what it was. In other words, Obama was successful in what he was trying to do. And so the Russians came in and they said, look, you want to fight terrorism? We'll join you. We're going to move in. We've got an air base in southern Syria. And the forces on the ground, you keep saying, Obama keeps saying, we need Arab forces on the ground. You've got something called the Syrian army. Why not use them if you want to defeat terrorism? Well, because Obama's policy is Assad has to go, meaning you can't support his army, meaning you're going to tear down the one impediment to an Al-Qaeda ISIS takeover of Syria. And if they take over Syria, Lebanon is next. No telling what would happen, Jordan, and so on. So the Russians came in, and they immediately discovered two things. One is that the Syrians will fight if they have some backup. And so the Russians started launching airstrikes that were targeting the actual forces of the terrorists, included among which were the tankers, the oil tankers, that were moving stolen oil from Iraq, and Syria into Turkey. And the U.S. wasn't bombing these tankers. Supposedly, we were going to stop ISIS from getting funded. We didn't tell the Saudis to stop funding them. We didn't stop the oil. What were we doing? We didn't stop dropping weapons in the middle of the desert that ISIS got. We were supposedly arming moderate Syrians, and moderate Syrians were afraid to show their faces. So ISIS and Al-Qaeda got the weapons we were dropping. So the Russians went in and started hitting these tankers and started exposing the Turkish duplicity. And Turkey responded by shooting down a Russian jet, which they claimed was over their territory, which could have sparked a war, and possibly even, if Russia would have fought back or done something in retaliation, the Turks would have gone to NATO and under, I think, Article 5 or Article 6, insisted that NATO come in to defend them. Then you would have had World War III between the West and Russia. But the Russians didn't. The Russians kept their focus. They kept going at the terrorist infrastructure. And now we're on the verge of a major victory here, of the Syrian government forces, backed by the Russians, backed by Iran, are about to defeat the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, so-called Syrian rebels in Aleppo. And then that's on the border with Turkey. So the Russians reported this week that there are Turkish troops massed on the other side of that border. Will Turkey go in? We don't know right now. But this is why Lynn said they had to get O'Malley out of the race and clear the deck so there's no LaRouche input directly into the presidential campaign. Because Obama is committed to escalating this war. Now you have to think about this for a minute. I don't know how many people know how World War II started. Hitler cooked up this idea that Poland was about to attack Germany, and then he moved into Poland, and then that forced the treaty agreements from France and Britain to declare war on Germany, and that's how the war started. World War I, you had a massing of forces after an assassination, and they kept massing and massing and massing, and it was only a matter of time before they started shooting. Now, that's where we are today. Next week in Brussels, the defense ministers of NATO are going to be hunkered down in a bunker where they're going to be conducting war games that are based on the presumption, what would you do if Russian airborne and armored assault into Latvia occurred? Now, how likely is something like that? It's about as likely as the Houston Texans winning the Super Bowl. The Russians have no interest in going into Latvia. Latvia is another economic basket case. It's for the same reason the Russians, if they wanted to, they could have taken over Ukraine. They don't want Ukraine. Ukraine is broke. They tried to help Ukraine. But why are we having war games assuming Russia is the great threat to us? Well, to put the pressure on the Russians, to put the pressure on the Europeans, to have to stay with the alliance, that is, keep the anti-Russian sanctions up and so on. So this is why LaRouche is saying we're headed toward this war danger immediately. Now, the other thing on what's driving it, how many of you have heard of a bank called Deutsche Bank?
Deutsche Bank?
Yeah. It's the largest bank in Germany, although it's not really even in Germany anymore. It's based in London. It has, next to Citibank, the largest derivative obligations in the world. Over $70 trillion of derivative obligations, which are completely unfunded and unbacked. They don't have insurance to cover them. They don't have money to cover them. They're continuing to buy and sell them. And everyone knows that they're essentially a bankrupt bank. Their stock has fallen 31% since the beginning of January. This is the most important bank that's in Germany. The largest French banks just released a report this week, or a report was released on them, that they're heavily involved in the oil derivative markets. Societe Generale, one of the largest, I think is 10% of their loan portfolio is in oil debt. What's happening with the oil debt? It's about to explode because the oil debt is based on companies going into debt to do new drilling and exploration with the idea that oil would be $70, $80, $90 a barrel. And now it's hovering around $30 and threatening to go lower. What happens if you borrowed money that you pledged to pay it back based on the expectation you're going to get $90 a barrel, and you're now getting $30 a barrel? Have you ever heard of mortgage-backed securities?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. They don't have the money coming in to service the debt, much less to pay down the debt. And so we have a moment where the banking system of the Western world is teetering. They thought they were going to solve it with something called bail-ins, that banks would sell bonds that would be slightly higher interest, that would give them new capital, and that those bonds, if the bank started to crash, they could seize the bonds to keep the bank solvent. Well, no one bought the bonds. Who's going to buy a bond if the deal is you get 3% if it's good, but if the bank fails, you lose everything? And then you hear about what's going on with these banks. Who would buy a bond like that? Would you, Beverly? Betty, would you?
Nope.
Not even Ted.
Why not take a risk?
Nobody would. So they've sold none of these bonds, so they're not recapitalizing. So what is the only source left for them of money? Money of the depositors, which is what a bail-in is. You get these unsecured bonds, and then you turn the deposits into unsecured investments. It's no longer a deposit. It's not your money. It's now the bank's money. And they can seize it if they need it under the bail-in rules. So people are literally, I'm sure every night in Europe, they're mapping out plans. What's the quickest way to get to the bank to withdraw money in case the bail-in starts? And you know what? With modern digital banking, there's no way to get to the bank before the bail-in starts. Once they start, boom, your money's gone. Just ask several thousand investors or depositors in Cyprus or in Italy.
That's a dumb question.
Just let me finish, Ted, because we want to move to Kesha in just a minute. So you have this accelerating financial collapse underway. Obama goes on television and says, we're in the strongest recovery and we've got to continue this. And of course, he's saying that's why you need to elect Hillary. When the fact is that people who look at the US economy know it's a shell, because our manufacturing sector continues to shrink. People who are working at living wages, the number is shrinking. People who are unemployed but not even counted as part of the labor force is growing. There are now 94 million people in this country of working ages who are not working. Now, it doesn't mean that some of them aren't disabled and some of them aren't new mothers who stay home with kids, but 94 million? That's a record number. So how can you say, well, we're creating all these jobs and everything's strong? It's called lying. So when LaRouche says it's an unprecedented moment, the bankers know this, Wall Street knows it, the British Crown knows it, the people who run Obama know it. And their marching orders to Obama are that you have to push and push until you can get Russia and China to back down and not go ahead with their new plans for a new trading and financial system. And if they don't back down, you have to be prepared to go to war with them. And Obama is a soulless, satanic figure. He's an obsessive narcissist. Now, what's the key thing about a narcissist? No capacity to empathize with the victims of their crimes. In fact, an obsessive narcissist is someone who says, well, you're suffering because of your own problems. I'm great. I'm doing everything right. Now, how do you have a president like that and no one fighting to get rid of him? You know, the line keeps being, well, he's only going to be in for another 11 months. It used to be he's only going to be in for another year. He's only going to be in for another 2 years. He's only going to be in for a second term. Well, at what point do you decide he's done too much damage to leave him in there? After the world goes up in flames in a nuclear war? Or after a total collapse of the banking system so that there's no food, no medicine, no gas and oil available for anybody to move? You can't wait. So what LaRouche has identified is this is the ideal moment to move to throw this guy out. and to go to this new paradigm based on Glass-Steagall, which is an end to the funny money in banking, and secondly, new productive credit, Hamiltonian-style credit, to rebuild the productive sector of this economy. Now, for what purpose? So we can have more smartphones or smart cars? No, so that we can actually take up the greater challenges that most people think are impossible. See, if you're going to start by saying we want to do something that seems impossible, like throw out Obama, why then become practical? We got to keep seeking to do the impossible. Space exploration, end disease, get rid of the British Empire, which is one of the biggest cancers on the planet. It is the biggest cancer on the planet. And so and here's the good thing. I think that even though Obama's a satanic figure, and most people have submitted to him, I don't think most Americans are happy about it. I don't think most Americans like where their lives are going. They look at the future in fear. And if you can inspire people by giving them a sense of hope that we can build something new, we can produce our way out of this, we can create a future where our children will love classical learning as opposed to hate school and spend their time in school tweeting each other. Now, if you can actually create a situation where children are inspired by the great ideas of the past with the intent that they become a mind that will help create the future, then you've broken the power of this empire. And that's what Kesha is going to talk about, how the development of a competent space program, which has been destroyed by two Bushes and Obama. You know, one of my associates says Obama's idea of a space program is land astronauts on a hemorrhoid. Or I should say an asteroid, but it's basically the same idea. There are top NASA people who testified before Congress this week who said there's absolutely no purpose in the world to do this, scientific or otherwise. And the Congress said, well, thank you, we appreciate you coming here. And then they're not going to stop the program. So this is where we are in the world. Let me take just Ted's question quickly, and then Kesha can come up here, because I want to have this. All right, you can take it later. Go ahead, Kesha.
Good. Okay. Hello.
Hi.
So I want to take up first of all, starting off for what Harley started with. Just give me 1 second here, because I want to develop that a little bit further here. When he made the point that we're standing, as LaRouche said, at a unique unprecedented turning point in history. And one thing that he goes on further to say is that no one yet knows what it will bring, and whether for much better or for much worse. But we must see to it that it is much better. So now, he also goes on in this remarks that he makes, Mr. LaRouche makes, that the only things we can rely on to guide our actions is these unique days of destiny. In these unique days of destiny are the most deeply known and most fundamental truths. He says that these are not what most of the falsely educated would say they are. What is known to each of us most intimately is the fundamental nature of man, not the practical man, but the man we meet only when man ventures out into space. So that's what we have to look at right now, is that we have a situation where nobody knows what's going to happen. These are unprecedented times, but how do we come to understand the uniqueness of mankind that actually can set the pace and direction for where mankind is going? And that is what China is representing right now as a new direction and vision for the world that even even the people who are making the plays, so-called the British Empire, that think that they have everything going in the direction that they want to go, that think that they are carrying out their policy for population reduction and reducing the population as their intention is and has been to less than 1 billion people. They don't even have an understanding of what's coming down, that everything is completely at a point where nobody has this thing under control, and it can be taken and must be taken for the win. So I'm going to go through that, but I wanted to say that first of all, I want to point people's attention to a presentation that I did along with my colleagues Benjamin Denniston of the LaRouche PAC science team and Jeffrey Steinberg on yesterday. It can be found on our website. The broadcast that we did on the question of what's happening with this war drive and the direction that we need to take mankind in from the standpoint of our vision to represent and develop a conception of why we need a space program, why we need a space program as the way that we're going to move mankind out of this threatened direction of war and death and economic collapse. So now in that presentation, what I developed is a conception, this idea that mankind is a unique species that evolves by changing the conception in relationship, changing our conception in relationship to the universe, and that the space program is our most advanced way of doing that. So at that time, I also presented the ideals of a great visionary by the name, and I don't know, have anybody ever heard of the guy named Kraft Erica?
Oh yeah. I've heard the name.
Yeah. So Kraft Erica was a German-born scientist, and he had this conception that he drew out called the extraterrestrial imperative. He was an engineer and helped with development of quite an expansive development of what it would look like in terms of the role of mankind colonizing the moon, how he actually developed whole platforms and plans for what we will be doing in terms of the necessity for the development of the moon. And also, he really had a philosophy that got beyond just practical engineering developments of, we go to the moon and we do these things based on just formulas and mathematics. But he had a higher conception of why it was even necessary, what it meant for the development of mankind here on Earth and our expansion out into the cosmos, out into the moon, development of space as a whole, and the development of the galaxies. And one thing that Kraft Erica did, though, is that he was sort of like LaRouche. He was a real forecaster, because he warned about, he put forth what was called 3 fundamental laws of astronautics. And in those 3 fundamental laws, he says, one second. One, nobody and nothing under the laws of the universe impose limitations on man except man himself. Second, not only the Earth, but the entire solar system, as much of the universe as he can reach under the laws of nature, are man's rightful field of activity. And 3, by expanding through the universe, man fulfills his destiny as an element of life endowed with the power of reason and the wisdom of the moral law within himself. So he develops these 3 laws, which can be found, and further explanation of some of Kraft Erica's work can be found in a publication that we did called An Extraterrestrial Imperative, and some of it is in our 21st Century Planetary Defense pamphlet, which was a special report that we put out, which is a brilliant report, and I'll let people find that on our website. But I want to develop something else from Kraft Erica that kind of pulls this together, because I'm going to come back to this, and actually these three fundamental laws, and we're going to develop on them a little bit more, because they really get to the principle of why a space program is essential for changing the conception of mankind and mankind's understanding of who we are as a species, not just some kind of going out into space, having no mission, having no vision, spending a bunch of money. And why are we spending this money on space when we can't feed the people here? Well, if the way you're thinking about how we're going to solve the problems that are facing mankind here on Earth, whether it be stopping starvation, stopping wars, stopping viruses, is from the standpoint of how we're spending money, you're off. And that is where you're taking up the fundamental, you're going against the fundamental law of what Kraft Erica states up front, that nobody and nothing under the natural laws of the universe can impose any limitations on man except man himself. So the reason why we don't have enough food, we haven't solved these problems, is because we've put limitations on ourselves, because we haven't ventured out into space to figure out what is the unknown, what is it that we can come to better understand about the planet that we live on by actually getting off the planet we live on. And I mean, to some people it might seem a little bit far-fetched, but it's real. So now let's see what happens to a society when we actually don't follow with these fundamental laws, and and what's in store for mankind when they accept a policy of no growth, when they accept the policy of death, or go along with the intentions that there are too many, this idea that there are too many people on the planet, and we can solve our problems if we just, stop having all these people on the planet. Kind of seems crazy, but I want Ian to put up real quick here the chart from Kraft Erica really quickly.
Move the chair.
Oh, that's what that is. Okay, this is let's see. Yeah, we can make it a little bit bigger here, and
also the cup of water too.
Okay. That's how this works.
Where do you want to start?
Oh, right there. That's okay. So, Kraft Erica. The name of this chart. This chart was developed in 1971, and it was a part of the writings that Kraft Erica put together called The Extraterrestrial Imperative. And what he does in here is it's very insightful. And most people can say, well, anybody can do this, but you really have to have a conception of what happens and why is it that people think that accepting a society of no growth can actually be something that can be sustained, or that mankind can survive under. It's insane. So now, if you look at the far left over there, you have, well, first of all, he starts off, oh, here it is, I'm trying to find it. Preservation of civilization and human growth potential. So we're going from a growth society. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but you can see what growth requires is extraterrestrial industrialization, global industrial revolution, a society that is part of what he called, developed here, an open world outgrowing development. So you're having an outgrowing development of the world, which he says is not a part of a closed system. And the problem is most of our education system has taught us that the world we live in is an entropic enclosed system, which is completely false. That it is the nature of mankind to venture out into the cosmos, into the galaxy, into space, which is what actually produces a productive society. Industrially productive society, scientifically, manufacturing. Just think about it. When we went to the moon and we had the vision for President John F. Kennedy, what was the benefit to mankind? It was that we were actually putting forth a forward direction and mission that was leading the world to be able to solve the problems of mankind. Even with the idea of how we solved, Kennedy had a Food for Peace program, how we solved the food crisis, how we solved the crisis of war. One, because we're going to be collaborating with other nations on things that mean a little bit more than fighting over petty resources or fighting about religious differences, but we would have a common mission and a common aim. Now, when you don't actually go in that direction and you go with the idea of a closed system, then what Craft Erica develops here at the bottom in what happens with a closed world, entropic world, people fighting over resources, killing each other, then it's inevitable that you're going to have a policy of a society of extreme poverty, mass starvation, wars, nuclear wars. Didn't Harley just talk about that a second ago? And increases in death rates. So, I'm sorry, thank you. So Craft Erica definitely understood that, and he made a real forecast of what happens if we follow and continue down and allow for the British Empire to carry out its intentions of population reduction. And Mr. LaRouche made a very, clear statement that should be thought about, is when people say, well, China and Russia are the targets. What this points to is that China and Russia are not really the targets. Mankind is the target. To the policy to put forth a policy of mass population reduction, this doesn't have anything to do specifically with China and Russia, although you have the idiot Obama in the White House who's continuing to provoke war against these nations because he despises what they truly represent for the direction of mankind. But what we have to be honest and serious about here is that there is such a thing as a policy of population reduction, and what that really means. When Obama shut down the manned space program, shut down the shuttle program, the Constellation, what was he really doing? You look at it from the standpoint that it's not about cutting funding, but it's about the fact that the intention is to stop the progress of mankind. Now,
Are you filming the picture?
yeah, thank you. So, so, but as Mr. LaRouche said, we're standing at a unique and unprecedented turning point in history. And that even the people who are pushing this insane policy don't know what the plays are going to be. And that's something we have to think about. Now,
Don't know what the what are going to be?
the plays, they think they have the plays all figured out,
Oh.
but they really don't know what the score is here. So
Is that a sport analogy?
I'll leave the sports analogies to Harley. but since I won't be watching the Super Bowl anyway. Now, so let's go back and look at, as I said again, we're going to look at this fundamental laws of astronautics that Kraft Erica points out. And he says, nobody and nothing under the natural laws of the universe imposing any limitations on man except man himself. That's one of my favorite ones. So, and you know, it really gets at the heart of LaRouche's remarks that I made at the beginning, that we can rely on the guidance of our actions in these unique days of destiny are in the most fundamental, the most deeply known and fundamental truths. And this is really the understanding of man that has put China at a clear advantage in the midst of a collapsing transatlantic financial system. You know, Harley just drew out the picture now of this thing is gone. It has blown. And there's nothing that's going to save this financial system. Now, if everybody's focused on that, instead of the fact that China is determined that they're not going to allow any limitations to be imposed on mankind. And you got idiots here in our US Congress who say, oh, China's the enemy, Obama, China's the enemy. We're trying to wage war against China when they are the ones who are restoring the only advantage, moral advantage for mankind that has been swept away by the current trends of the British Empire and this collapsing transatlantic system. So anything that the people who are falling into that trap are doomed for failure. And that's just reality. And I wrote, I want some people to have a copy of that. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, thank you. So I wrote an article that's in the new edition of this week's EIR. I'll just read it. Someone's holding up this thing. I'm not going to read the article, but the title is Genius in the Use of Yes. And I put, in this article, I'm putting forth a challenge that abolishing and ending once and for all the policy and destruction, the policy of the United States and the death policy, then the intention of the evil British Empire requires an immediate understanding and acting upon the moral advantage which now has been presented through the actions in particular China. And so you see that China is now representing a new future as of mankind in the space program, and through what the president of China, Xi Jinping, has called a win-win strategy of cooperation. And this has been the decades-long fight and initiative of Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche, as we have been working with these nations and in the United States to break the stronghold and control of this financial oligarchy and this system, which has continued to go along with this policy, push through this policy of debt. Now, I'm going to go through, my colleague Ben actually went through quite a bit of this in his presentation yesterday, but I want to develop just a little bit of what China is doing, the developing of their space policy, and what does this mean for the world? What does it mean for the world, first of all, that China is developing rovers and lunar missions that are exploring the inner surfaces of the moon down to a depth of about 90 feet? How can this shed light? How can this shed light not only the development of the moon, but the entire solar system as a whole? And so, one thing I want to look at, first of all, there. How deep did you say? 90 feet. Mm-hmm. There have been there's been about there is an intention of 5 missions, which actually started going back to 2007 with China's Schlanger 1 lander, and they have developed over 5 missions, with the talk of actually and a rumor of another mission that's going to come out pretty soon here. But one thing, I'll get into what those missions are in a second. But first of all, I want to focus on a specific one that took place in 2013, and then kind of tie these together a bit, but then kind of get at it from a sense of not just to point out, okay, China's doing this mission and China's doing that mission, but what have they been developing is the real question at hand from the standpoint of their forward progress of mankind and where we could be going versus what happened under Obama and Obama's policy for mass kill. Because this guy is the #1 killer, and the world knows this. There's no forward progress under Obama. And when Obama, first of all, I made this point in yesterday's broadcast, shut down push forth his policy in shutting down the Constellation program and really defunding, dismantling the manned space program and taking away any kind of real national mission where we were slated to not just go back to the moon, but there were policies for further long-term development of the moon. That was gone. Now Obama was doing that in 2010, along with when he was pushing this policy for the insane population reduction policy of the Hitler healthcare policy. Now, I can go through, that's a different story, but it's the same thing. It's not a different policy when Obama was pushing a no-growth, green environmentalist agenda, at the same time pushing a healthcare policy that was going to benefit the Wall Street bankers and the insurance companies more than the people, and then shutting down the most valuable and advanced stages of science necessary for the progress of mankind by shutting down our potential for the space program, turn it into a scrap heap of, nothing real valuable coming from it. Now you got a bunch of private sector people trying to fight over who's gonna take somebody up to Mars or something that really has no national mission whatsoever. Now, China was coming in and they were saying, we have to restore the identity and vision of John F. Kennedy. They were doing what we were not doing. Because while we had Obama in the White House dismantling, China was progressing rapidly in terms of the advancements of the space program. And look what we did. 2010, what was China doing in 2010? It launched what was called its Chang'e 2 mission. It was engineered to back up the Chang'e 1, which was launched as a lunar orbiter in 2007. And it orbited the moon and flew past an asteroid, Tautis, in 2012. So, you know, that's just to give you an example. But it actually had a focus that we had to rapidly develop mankind's position, as you want to call it, or development in space. So now, in 2014, a very particular mission that was put forth was, hold on one second, I want to read a quote from Chinese president here. The Schlanger 3 lander, and it was a lunar lander that, this was one of the most exciting missions. It's still actually there on the surface of the moon, from what I understand, and that this was the spacecraft, the Schlanger 3 lander, along with the rover, that laid the basis for goal for long-term industrial development of the moon. And as a result, it developed things such as an ultraviolet telescope and a cosmic observatory to do astronomical observations for the first time on the lunar surface of the moon, on the surface of the moon. And they also, out of that, had an ultraviolet instrument to study the Earth's ionosphere. And when this mission actually took place, the president of China, Xi Jinping, actually spoke to a conference, a space science and engineers conference, and he said, and people who participated on the development of the Schlanger 3 mission, he said, dare to walk the unwalked paths. Constantly seek excellence through solving difficulties, and accelerate the shift to innovation-fueled development. Xi Jinping says, innovations in the science and technology must be put in a core position in the country's overall development. Innovation is the soul of a people and the source for a country's prosperity. He went on to emphasize that the Schlanger 3 mission was China-made in every sense of the phrase. But I like this point that he makes. Innovation is the soul of a people and the source for a people's prosperity. It is true. And so venturing out into the unknown, we're not just talking about the idea that we're going to put some instruments on the moon or instruments out into space that's not going to have any relevance whatsoever on what's happening here on Earth, because it is going to have relevance. And because some people don't think that we can solve things such as why we have numbers of, increased numbers of people that are dying through cancer. We have viruses like the Zika virus that has erupted throughout most of South America and other parts of the world, even here in the United States. And then all we can do is just, cross our fingers and hope that we don't get bit by a mosquito or something. Why can't we solve these problems? Yesterday when I was giving the presentation, I was wearing a red dress, and I was wearing the red dress because it was Wear Red, National Wear Red Day for stroke and heart disease awareness. And we wear pink for breast cancer and all of these types of things. I was wearing the red. I lost my mother this day after Christmas. Passed away from a stroke. She had a couple of strokes beforehand, and I'm thinking about it as I'm sitting here, like, we have people at very young ages who are dying because of the limitations that have been imposed on us, that we have put on ourselves, because we don't have a direction or vision for mankind, because we don't see mankind as a unique species, that everybody's going to die, and that's inevitable. But the question is, what is the meaning you're going to give to human life? Is the only thing we're going to be doing to actually solve the problem of heart disease and strokes and cancer and so forth is wearing pink and red? That's not human. So, and people say, oh, you're never going to solve it because the big money people, that's the way they make their money. Well, it's probably true, but Wall Street has to be brought down. The big money people have to be brought down, because human lives have to be saved. And that's how we have to think about the fight that we're waging right now, is that we have to have a different conception of the role of mankind. And what's being presented to us right now from the standpoint of the conditions of the world we live in are not future oriented, but are that there are limitations that have been put on us and that we can't solve them. Now, you may not be able to stop people from dying, because we're not mortal. I mean, that's just gonna happen. But what we can do is we can make sure that we actually start to solve these problems. And when you're thinking from this point, from this standpoint, from this idea of development that was laid out by the president of China, from the idea and the vision that was laid out by John F. Kennedy, then you have a different means by which you're fighting. And you actually understand more why this fight is so necessary, because we got to make sure that the young people that are coming up, that are not even born yet, have an idea that we were fighting for their future. So I think that aspect of why we need a space program should be made very clear to people, that it's fighting for something much higher, a much higher identity than any of the fights over political sides or differences could even imagine. It's not, this whole thing about this stupid candidates, the presidential elections, they're playing you for fools. And the only way we're going to get out of this is to stop being enslaved and actually look at, as I said before, the moral advantage that has been presented by the vision and direction that mankind could be going in if we actually were to take it up. So I'm going to leave it at that and see if you guys got any thoughts, questions.
Well, the
Thank you.
right, they I wouldn't even know where to start with that DDT.